So welcome along to this session. This is the first in our series of podcast-style conversations between team members from the Student Learning Development team. I'm Dr. Scott Ramsey. I'm the Effective Learning Advisor for the College of MVLS. And I'm joined by my colleague, Michelle. Michelle, would you like to say a bit about who you are?
Sure. So I'm Michelle Hay. I'm a senior PhD student here at Glasgow. I'm interdisciplinary, so I specialise in ancient pathogen genomics. But it's basically hunting down disease in Viking age. So I look at 1,000-year-old subfossil vectors and I extract the DNA from said vectors and then look to identify the pathogen DNA within that. And yeah, I'm looking forward to this podcast, a very important topic, and hopefully you'll learn a lot from it between the musings of myself and Scott, with any luck.
Hopefully. Yeah, and the topic that you mentioned there, the topic for today is academic presentations.
Mm-hmm.
But just before we get onto that, I've never actually heard you say about your research in that way. And you make it sound like the plot of Jurassic Park, but for ancient pathogens rather than dinosaurs.
I get that so often. I know, but I'm not bringing the diseases alive, so you don't have to worry.
Okay.
But yeah, it's some similarities there, some similarities, some differences. But yeah, essentially, it's extracting the DNA out of the fossils, not in amber though. We're going beyond those technologies now to use it in soft tissue. But yes, it is hunting down the diseases of the past. There's no two ways about that.
One of the nice things about working in a department like this is that we get to teach students from all four colleges, and we also have people like yourself from all four colleges. It just so happens that I'm a geneticist as well, but we do have such a range of people. And it's nice, I think, for the people listening to this to get out small flavours peppered here and there of what you can do when you move on to postgraduate research.
Exactly.
But since we're here to talk about presentations today, let's come on to that. So first question, what do you think has made the best presenters that you've ever seen be the best presenters, or we could do the negative side and we could say what's been the worst ones and why are they so bad? Yesterday's class was a lot of advice about how to teach, not how to teach, a lot of advice about how to deliver a presentation, quite specifically within an academic context, i.e. an assignment for a class to listen to, and that is something that you'll be graded on. But that's not necessarily all that there is to presenting. And we've just been talking about going on to do postgraduate research, many different avenues you could take that. You might be doing some public communication of your science. You might be changing field completely. So many different ways to interpret this. So with an open door, what have been the best presenters and why for you?
Yeah. I think without a doubt, the best presenters for me are those that engage with the audience and those that are in touch and tune with the audience, by far. You know, for you to really deliver an excellent presentation, you have to know your audience, you have to know who they are, you have to be able to communicate with them and be in sync with them. And I think that engagement with the audience is by far the key to a successful presentation. And the flip side of that, if you like, for the bad side of presentations, are those that don't engage. And normally that comes through those that are actually reading as opposed to talking to the audience. So they'll be reading notes, they'll be reading script, or they'll be just facing the PowerPoint and basically talking to a wall. But what they won't be doing is engaging with the audience themselves. And I think that's the key aspect to a successful presentation, is that engagement, that knowledge exchange, because you know what you've done, you know your research, but your audience doesn't. Okay, if they wanted to read about it, they'd get your publication or they'd get a book that's, you know, doing that actual subject area, doing that specialism. But they want to hear you, they want to hear your take on your research, they want to know your thoughts on your research. And, you know, you need to have that engagement there. You need to have that eye contact, that body language that's fluid and open. And, you know, the flip side of that is where the audience is bored, where they're switched off, where their mind is away thinking what they're going to have for dinner or whatever, you know, and it's a disconnect with the audience. And if you find that you're disconnected with the audience, that's going down the wrong pathway. So you need to look at that and think, how am I going to rectify this? What methods can I put in to make this turn into an engaging performance? Because that's essentially what a presentation is. It's a performance that you're doing. You're doing knowledge exchange, but you're performing to the audience and you're interacting with the audience. So that's what I'd say is the two flip sides, if you like, between a good presentation and a poor presentation.
It's quite a big jump, I suppose, trying to think back myself to what it was like to present for the first couple of times in my academic career, because
Mm,
the most obvious thing that you have to convey is the topic that you're there to tell everyone about.
mhm, yeah,
At first, your focus is on, am I telling people the right stuff? And it's not until you get confident that your material is solid that sometimes you
mhm,
can then start to think about these other things on top. But they're so important. One of the things I often tell students or point out to students who are nervous
mhm,
is that if they think back to the times they sat in a crowd to be the audience at a lecture, another student's presentation,
mhm.
0% of those times have you ever gone in thinking, oh God, I hope this presentation is really rubbish. Right? You're automatically on the side of the
Mhm,
presenter because you want
mhm.
to have a good experience as an audience
Yeah,
member. So getting over that fear of being on the stage and feeling like you've got to impress this audience because they're already judging you is kind of an artificial thing. They don't want you to fail. They want you to
no.
do really well, because if you
Mm.
do well, then they'll have a good time as well. But it's really hard to get over that.
Yeah, I think
To
that there's a couple of things you've touched upon there that absolutely ring true. The first thing we are talking when you're first teaching and knowing the subject matter, I think with me crossing over from science into archaeology, and obviously I'd done a master's to do that, enable that crossover before going into my doctorate. So I'd done a master's in Celtic and Viking archaeology. And then I was teaching archaeology and, had a fantastic mentor, Dr. Michael Given, in teaching me, if you like, how to teach. He took a great leap of faith with me for teaching. He's seen something in me at that point I never seen in myself, I think it's fair to say. And there was nerves those first few times because, like you're saying, it's the knowledge aspect. And I was questioning myself, even though I prepped, even though I knew the work, I was still questioning myself, am I qualified enough to do this? And it's one of these things that you have to sometimes take a leap of faith in yourself as well. And sometimes people can have more belief in you than you have in yourself at certain points. As I say, they see something that you don't necessarily see at that point in time, but they grow that within you. And that's really an excellent thing. But you do have nerves that first few times. There's no two ways about that, because it's thinking, what question are they going to ask me that I may not have the answer to? And what I learned from the get-go was to say, might not know everything here. You might ask a question that I don't know, but I can guarantee you, if I don't know it, I'll find out the answer for you. The other thing that you're bringing up as well was about, you know, audiences want to be comfortable. So as a presenter, if you're uncomfortable, the audience is going to be uncomfortable as well. But the audience is wanting you to do well. That's a key point that you made there. We're going along to listen to you talk about your research. We want to hear that. We're engaged with that. We're excited to learn about that and to learn something new ourselves about the area or the subject matter being discussed. So, nobody's going in there saying, I hope this works out really poorly. That's, you'd have to be really, quite an unpleasant character to want to do that. And for nerves as well, one thing that I learned when I was doing the TEDx training, which I've done previously, was my coach there, it was a TEDx trainer, said to us from the get-go that, remember, it's not about you, it's about your audience. And a lot of nerves come from thinking about you. How am I going to be perceived? How will I sound? How do I look on stage? Will the audience understand me? Okay, it's all about me. And what she said to me and to the whole group, it was a group of us that was there, was, remember that that's the ego. And we all kind of looked, and like, the ego? Where has that came from? I'm nervous here, I'm not being egotistical. But she was right. It's the ego, because it's about you. I. Nothing about your audience. So if you shift your perspective from yourself onto your audience, and it's what I was talking about earlier, that mind shift, looking at your audience, interacting with your audience, engaging with your audience, then you'll find that the nerves will decrease because your focus and your perspective shifted to your audience. And everybody has nerves. I still have nerves. I'm sure Scott probably does. I don't know, but I presume butterflies before you go on and doing something. That's a perfectly natural thing. But if at the moment you're feeling physically sick before you give a talk, or you're shaking before you give a talk, believe me, those can be overcome. If you're really worried about giving talks, that can be changed, and you can enjoy giving talks, which is a good place to be, because in academia you're going to have to give a lot of talks. So yeah.
yes, you are. And you mentioned TEDx training there. So
Mm,
first of all, for anybody who has never just come across TED and TEDx, Could you tell us a little, just a couple of sentences to say what that actually is, and tell us about this training that you're talking about, and some of the things that you've learned on that?
Yeah. Well, TEDx is a world phenomenon, I suppose, really, where giving talks is classed. It's large seminar-based. It's a huge audience, essentially. It's worldwide. They do it in various subject matters, various topics. They have a lot of star presenters, if you like, giving talks on very generic aspects of what they do. So it's very much about public engagement. There'll be mixed audiences. It's not a specific audience. And you're taught how to interact from a very technical side of things, as well as from the performance side of things too. So you just have to Google in TEDx. They have the large arenas that they do, the arena tours as such, and they also have local ones. There's TEDx Glasgow, for instance, which is done as well, which is in the more sort of micro scale. And they go often in themes. So they can talk about, say, climate change, for instance. That would be one theme that they do. They could talk about technology within society. That could be another theme. So all that, I mean, hundreds of themes. TEDx has been going for years. So the best thing you can do there is Google it. You can go onto YouTube and look at many presenters give fantastic presentations, and look at how they're giving the presentation, look at how they're interacting, look at their body language, because these are great tips that you can actually start incorporating into your own presentations as well. From the TEDx training side of things, that was a coach. We actually had two coaches, but one coach in particular that dealt with myself, that was a TEDx trainer. So she coached the people to go up on to TEDx and to give talks. And it was a fantastic course. It was a very intensive course, but we learned so much about giving presentations. And, you know, this isn't just about your own performance. It isn't just about your knowledge, about how you create your slideshows and such like. It's about the technical aspects. It's about your lighting. It's about the audience. It's about the audio. It's about your placement within the stage as a whole. So all these different aspects all come together to produce an excellent presentation. And it was an intensive course, but we learned so much through it, and things that I never even knew I never knew.
So what would you say were some of the most surprising things that you realized through that course that you hadn't ever thought about before?
You know, it was funny because they'd done a lot of music-based training with us, and how to breathe, the breathing exercises, and how to lift your voice as well, from the abdomen. So, you know, there's a lot of physical training involved with it. And these were
Okay.
things that I never gave a thought to. And just now, obviously, we're talking colloquially here for the podcast, but when you're up on stage, I now implement different techniques that I never even knew existed, all to do with the abdomen and lifting it, so you can lift your voice to different levels, so you can project your voice out as well over large audiences, regardless of whether you have a mic or not. And these were things I'd never thought about. But the audio is so important for your audience, because if they don't hear you, you know, they're not getting any knowledge exchange there whatsoever. They're going to be lost, and then their mind goes wandering. That disconnect has been created. I think also it was mostly the technical aspects that was really raised for me. I was quite fortunate that I was at ease talking and giving presentations, but she certainly sharpened me up in many areas. There's no two ways about that, and that was very useful. It was useful to be made to think about different aspects of the audience, about reading the body language of the audience, I guess, as well, and becoming very aware of the body language of the audience. And of course, in biology in particular, your taught behaviour and such like that's integrated as part of your degree as such. But to actually home it into human body language was another experience.
So what sort of things did they tell you to look out for, and then what were the modifications that you would make based on what you were detecting?
It would be the body language, the posture of the individuals, but how to define the posture between those that are just relaxed. For instance, you may have a grumpy face, grumpy cat syndrome, you know, if you're just relaxed and you're zoned out. But you may actually be showing facial signals that you're not just relaxed, that you're disagreeing about something, that you're uncomfortable with something, perhaps some subject matter that's been discussed, or that perhaps you can't hear properly, perhaps you're straining because you can't hear, perhaps you can't see, perhaps your PowerPoint slides are too small, in the wrong colour, font, so forth. Or, you know, just slight movements, you know, movements of the body, movements of the shoulders, not and eye movements as well, obviously engagement with the audience as well. What's the eye saying to you? So, you know, a lot of different micro behaviours, micro signals, if you like, that we all send, because 80-90% of our communication is through body language. But it's about being consciously aware of that when you're talking to your audience and being able to pick up on that. And then, like you're saying, Scott, adjusting it. So saying, right, okay, first of all, identify that there is some body language, being displayed there. Identify what the root of that is, and then adjust it accordingly. Okay, so if it's audio, project louder. If it's a screen, maybe enhance it slightly. If it's a subject matter, discuss it in a different way. If somebody's not understanding something and you can see, that they're clearly not understanding something, repeat it in a different manner that makes it more easy, more digestible for the audience to understand. And that's perhaps more so relevant when you're dealing with non-specialist audiences as well, because we can use a lot of technological jargon, if you like, that members of the public, for instance, may not understand, but it's our default position. So, it's important just to be aware of the audience, to read the audience, essentially, is what I'd say. Yeah.
I'm trying to think of things that are easy to do on the fly if your next presentation is going to be the first or the second one that you've ever given.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe if I think back to my own honours presentation to the rest of my class, which is like the keystone presentation of your degree, is the bit where you get to say, here's what I have independently, and here are the results that I got.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if I, at that stage, would have had the ability to make a change to my PowerPoint slides in the moment, in the way that I confidently would be able to now, after having taught for many years, 10 years. But maybe one of the things that is more accessible is the idea of, like you say, gauging when someone hasn't understood something and rephrasing it. Like maybe you're talking through some data and you've got a graph up on the screen that nobody gets. Like this is one of the things that often helps is just going back to your axes and really explaining what it is that you're showing, because that's often what people get confused about. Right? You have some units up some axis for some experiment that you've done that nobody else in the room has ever tried. So then you've got to explain what that actually is measuring. Maybe you have to use some analogy to say, so we put things through the machine and they smashed together, and then we got this measurement of how heavy they are out the other side. And it might not actually be a direct measure of how heavy they are. It might be some proxy for that. So helping them reconstruct what actually happened to generate this graph will help your audience go sometimes from being a group of people who've got no idea about what's going on to maybe at least being able to understand the general pattern of what you've shown them, and then what you want them to have a rough idea about before you go on to the next slide.
Yeah, I think as well, don't be afraid to talk to your audience. Don't be afraid to say to them, how are we at this stage? Do you follow what I'm saying there? Do you need further explanation in certain points and so forth as well? Have that fluidity in your presentation that, and as you're saying there when you're talking about your honours presentation, you've been working on that, so you should hopefully know what you've been doing for your project quite well, so you should be able to have that space within the presentation that if you see that some people are confused by the data sets that you're given, that you can say to them, are you understanding this? Would you like me to explain this another way? And have the confidence to do that, have that interaction with the audience, and if somebody's looking critical and they say, well, I get this bit, but I'm not quite sure in that, then you can explain it further to them. And the chances are, if one person's saying that, there's quite a few people that's also thinking that. So you're explaining it to them as well. So it's about having the confidence. And yes, that comes with experience, but you have to take that leap of faith at some point. You have to cross that boundary at some point. So I always say the sooner the better there. And, remember, they're people. It's a different setting, but they're still people. It's still knowledge exchange. So, don't cause boundaries within your own mind, I guess is what I'm saying, that you can't say to your audience, that you can't speak to your audience because they become this block type thing. They're just people, and remember that, keep that in perspective. And it also helps your nerves there and with your interactions with them too.
A lot of people advise that you practice things plenty of times so that you are confident that you know what slide is coming up next, so that you're not always trying to worry about getting exactly the wording right, because you've got to follow the script, and if you lose track of the script, then then disaster there lies, right? So if you know generally what the next stage in your story is, you have a lot more freedom to play around and extemporize on what's on the slides in front of you. But where do you sit on the spectrum of practicing and rehearsing?
I don't probably would be that. As I say, I don't do scripts at all. I don't do them at all. It was the best lesson I ever got actually was with my undergraduate supervisor, and a fantastic man, very learned. And the very first presentation I ever did, which I think was actually my first year of undergrad, was just a little mini 5-minute presentation to get used to giving presentations, to talking about random things. I can't remember what the subject matter was. But I had little note cards then, and he stopped me from using them. And it was the best piece of advice I've ever had in academia, frankly, because he said, you know it in your head, you don't need that. And it was an excellent piece of advice. And I've never ever used scripts. I've never used note cards since. What I do use to keep me on point, because when you're talking about your research, you will go off on tangents, and I'm very guilty of doing that. So to keep myself on point, I use my PowerPoints. And when I'm doing my PowerPoint slides, that's me rehearsing, if you like. When I'm putting those slides into place, that's it getting fixed in my mind. That's this, and this, right? That's a nice flow. That's me done. That's it. I don't look at it again until I go up to give that presentation. And then I'll have a quick glance at the PowerPoints as I'm changing it. And that keeps me on point. That saves me going off on a tangent, discussing something else that I found interesting. I'm not reading a script. I'm not reading a piece of paper. And I've seen many people do that, and there's total disconnect with the audience. I'm totally focused on the audience. I'm totally facing them, talking to them continually, walking up and down, roundabout, and so forth. Owning the stage, shall we say, if you're looking at it from the performance side of things, interacting with the audience themselves, occasionally a quick glance up to the PowerPoint to keep me on point, to remember where I am within that presentation. But my attention, 99% of my attention is on the audience. I'm having a discussion, I'm having a conversation with that audience. And that's the key point. I'm not talking at them, I'm talking with them. I'm taking them along in a conversation. So yeah, I don't, the answer to your question, I've went off on a tangent there, but the answer to your question, Scott, is that no, I don't rehearse. And I think for me, that would be catastrophic to rehearse, because that's not the way that I work. And back to the TEDx coach here, she was the first one that said to me, because she was going round in a circle again, the 10 of us, and saying, how do you prepare for a presentation? And of course, the majority of people said, I rehearse it, I go over and over and over, and then, I'll do it in front of audiences and so forth. And that's absolutely fine. There's nothing wrong with that if that works for you. But, as it was getting nearer to me, I was thinking, oh heavens, I don't do any of this. I'm going to sound horrendous, And she said to me, that's absolutely fine. What you do is fine because it works for you. And that's all that matters. And that is another piece of excellent advice, I think, is what works for you, you go with that. Regardless if 99 people out of 100 do something different, but that's not going to work for you, then that's fine. It's okay to say, you know what, that works for you, that's great. But this doesn't work for me, but this does. And that's the thing about giving presentations. They're really individualistic. So it's what works for you. Go with that. And your audience will let you know if you've done a good job or not. So, just go with what you're comfortable with. That's what I'd say.
And you mentioned that you use your PowerPoint as the equivalent of what you had previously used note cards for. Like the PowerPoint is where you get your...
Absolutely.
I'm paraphrasing you here. It's where you get your inspiration slide by slide to then turn to the audience and talk about the topic. So I'm wondering, do you have a guide that you use for yourself, consciously or not? But if you think back to your slides, like, do you have a limit on how much content you put on each one? Or do you have any other restrictions on what you would put up on a slide by slide basis?
I'm very visual in my PowerPoint, so I have very little script at all. Sometimes I'll have some data popped up, but very, very little script. It's very much visualizations that I use per PowerPoint, maybe with a few words here and there. And that's what keeps me on track, and the rest I'm verbalizing to the audience. So, it's not, sometimes you see these PowerPoints and they're jam-packed with text, or they're jam-packed with text and charts and goodness knows what. That's completely the opposite from where I am. I'd be quite sparse in comparison to that. So I have the information that I think is going to be of use to the audience, that's going to help them visualize, contextualize what it is that I'm speaking about. But it is minimal and it's visual. So it's there to stimulate them, I guess, to stimulate them visually and to engage them within the presentation. But everything else comes from me. So yeah, as I say, and it's just a quick glance that I do to say, right, okay, that's where I'm at. Don't wander, Michelle. That's where you're at, So yeah.
Okay. And I suppose at the other end of the spectrum, if I can extemporize, I've used that word twice in 2 minutes, on what was covered in yesterday's class, we mentioned about how much we mentioned about the phenomenon of having too much text on a screen for your audience, and I didn't really say very much more about it at the time, but I guess this is a place to do that. So if you've got so much up there that your audience has to read it, if you've got a sentence, or you've got a, a bunch of phrases, might not be a completely grammatically complete sentence, but a bunch of phrases strung together with commas, and it runs basically to 3 lines for one bullet point. Your audience has to stop listening to you to be able to deal with that, because they can't, unless they're very special, very capable, they can't listen and read at the same time to 2 different strings of words. And it can be a hindrance as well to people who put that on and try to present it, because as soon as you get to that section of your PowerPoint, you often then feel like you do have to read that out word for word. And the audience can probably read it much more quickly than you can speak it. So you've ended up in this situation that my colleague, Dr. Andrew Struan, likes to talk about a lot, where you're basically slowing your audience down. Because if you were going to make them read that text, you might as well have just let them read it silently to themselves. They'll get through it in half the time that it would take for you to say it out loud. And everyone wants to hear you be passionate about your topic. They don't want to hear you read out some pre-prepared words about it, because the passion evaporates when you do that, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You lose all of the spontaneity of the tone of voice. And I've asked that same question that we started with, what makes a good presenter and what makes a bad one, to many classes over the years. And the number, well, in the top 3 answers that ever come up, the tone of voice is definitely in that top 3.
Yeah.
So do you speak with a tone of voice that has variations in it, like hopefully our 2 voices do right now, because we're not reading from the script?
Yeah.
Or as someone totally monotonous and flat the whole way through?
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
you
we've
do
all been
yourself
there. I
proud.
think we've all been that student in the lecture theatre that's just thinking, "Good Lord," as the seconds go by. So yeah, it's you'll just lose your audience with a monotonous tone. We've all been there. We've all been students or are students, and that sat in a lecture theatre with a particular lecturer who you just switch off as soon as you walk in. You're going to switch off because it's completely monotone. There's no enthusiasm. There's no spontaneity. It's just horrendous, really, isn't it? And unfortunately, there is quite a few people in academia that is like that, and that's unfortunate, because again, it's going back to knowledge exchange. It's going back to the point of giving a presentation, and the audience switches off. You switch off. If it's monotone and if they're disengaged with the audience, that's it. That audience is gone. They're mentally, they're out the room. So it's something to bear in mind, and I think that's why your audience is so important when you're giving presentations. And you can give death by presentations, it's known, where it is just all text in each slide, and it's completely pointless, because as Scott's saying there, the person will have read it in milliseconds compared to the time it takes for you to read it. And not only that, when you're reading it, you're facing the PowerPoint reading it. You're not connecting with your audience at all, So it's not a good situation to be in, and I'd say avoid it at all costs. So don't cramp it with words. Don't think that you need to put in sentences to get your point across. You don't. You will be doing that verbally. So yeah, that's what I'd say with that one.
And you mentioned something about knowing your audience in there and engaging with them. We've talked a lot, I think, with the implicit assumption that the audience is going to be in academia. It's going to be classmates. It's going to be the staff in charge of a course. But that's not necessarily always going to be the case. And whether the people who are listening to this know it or not right now, their career may take them into a place where they have to speak to people who are not, PhD qualified in the same subject that they've studied at university. So a TEDx actually is probably quite a nice example of that, where you've got a generalist audience. What would you say are some of the key things to think about when you're tailoring your message to someone who you don't have any knowledge about, the knowledge level of, like when you can't make assumptions about how much they know?
Yeah, you have to go midway there, I think. So it's gauging it as such. So you don't make it too basic. You certainly don't make it too technical. So you'd remove your technical terminology, and so forth. And again, it would be judging it with the audience when you're actually there in real time too. Now, of course, that takes experience to be able to do that to that extent. So for guys just starting off, if they don't know who their audience is, such as in public engagement events, if it's TEDx, if it's Pint of Science, if you're doing at the Science Museum, a lot of people in MVLS go over there and do some public engagement events. So there's many different ways that you'll be speaking to various audiences through your career, essentially. And what you have to do is think about your audience. You have to think about what they're going to understand. You're thinking about the language as a whole that you're going to use. Are you going to talk formal academic? Are you going to talk more colloquially, such as we're doing just now? You'll think about your setting in a different manner as well. You'll think about your presentation, PowerPoint presentation, in a whole different manner, because you have to make your presentation, your visualizations, more digestible. So instead of more complex visualizations, you're going to simplify it. You're going to look at ways that you can maybe use caricatures, say for instance, and cartoons to put across very complex processes. Okay, so there's different tools, different techniques that you can use, that you can implement, indeed that you have to implement when you're doing public engagement. So I always say it's a good idea when you're thinking about talking to the public to talk to members of the family that's not in academia or friends that's not in academia about your subject matter. Have a chat to them about it, see if they understand it. And they'll be good pointers for you. They'll say, I get that bit, but I don't really get this. What do you mean by that? What's that word? And that lets you adjust. It lets you just tweak it down or tweak it up. And, it sounds like a simple thing to do, but as I say, it's simplicity, it's complexity behind it. You have to know your stuff inside out to make a really complex thing sound simple. I don't know if that answers the question. I went off slightly in a tangent there again. Yeah.
No, not at all. Not at all. It does. And you and I both have experience with Let's Talk About X, which is our undergraduate research conference, which is open to presenters from any subject. And then the audience is also made up of people from any subject. And the idea with the name Let's Talk About X is the X can be exchanged for whatever subject you're going to hear about next. So one of the things that we often find there is the challenge of removing the difficulty that comes from just not knowing the vocabulary. And one way to deal with it is to define the vocabulary. So, I could say, as a geneticist, I could say, we're going to talk about small heat shock proteins, which is the type of proteins that I worked on. Mm-hmm. Or I could go with something that doesn't require someone to be able to parse those three words. They're small, they're proteins, and they're to do with heat shock. I could come up with some other kind of analogy to say that the job of these proteins is to protect against heat, and just call them heat protective proteins. So the two options there, which I kind of rolled together into one without thinking about it, was number one, you can say what your terminology is and define it. So if I was going to say to you deoxyribonucleic acid, which is the long version of DNA, we could go into a definition of what that actually means, and then assume that the audience has learned that after the first time they've heard it, and then you can then go on and say DNA later, and they know about the chemical, if that's important for your presentation. But the likelihood is that they won't have been able to do that because they've heard about it once in one very short presentation with no chance to revise it. So instead, with Let's Talk About X, our favorite recommendation is to say, go with the second option where you use some kind of other analogy, like the heat protective proteins version, rather than trying to teach your audience new words, because that's not what they've come along to learn about.
No. We've got a question there. Just before that, I'm just going to say with using different words and so forth, that's something I had a very sharp learning curve in with crossing over from science to archaeology, was how to explain what I was discussing. And it is something that you have to learn to communicate between even different academic disciplines. So it's not always public engagement, or we're focused in this, but it's also discussing your research within the different schools within the university as well, because there's different languages that's used. And that's something to be aware of. You're speaking to an academic audience, but it's a non-specific academic audience. So you still have to explain terminology, you still have to explain processes that they're not familiar with. So as I say, it turns into a really good exercise for yourself, because you have to think then of ways to explain these processes that's going to be understandable, but understandable at different levels. So yeah, so it's just to highlight that if you're working interdisciplinary, you will have to learn to do that, because it's different languages that you're speaking essentially, and it's bridging that, it's crossing over that. And again, it all comes down to communication. But we also have a question, Scott, if you want to take that.
Yeah.
Yep.
Sure. I'll take this. I'll take a first pop at this one because I can relate it to some of the things we talked about in the formal class that accompanies this podcast. So the question is, if I have a specific time to present information, for example, 7 minutes, how do I organize my presentation and the order of the information that I need to present? And so one of the big things that we tried to push yesterday was the idea of having a section where you tell the audience what you're going to tell them, and then a big chunk in the middle where you tell them it, and then a chunk at the end where you tell them what they just heard. And that's another way basically of saying to have an introduction, a middle part, and then a conclusion. But but what that first explanation I gave you does is it tells you what the purpose of your introduction and your conclusion should be, right? It's first of all to set the audience up so that they know what journey you're about to take them on. And at the end, to distill down all of the complex stuff that you might have shown them and just remind them what the take-home messages were. What was the biggest result that you found here? What was the biggest implication of whatever it was you presented? I think we've probably made an assumption in the way that we've described everything so far that you might be presenting research. That might not be the case. You might have just been told to go and look something up and then tell the rest of the class about it. So you might not have a biggest result to share at the end, but what's the take-home message essentially? And the organization on the way in between, it's hard to give one rule that fits all, but it could be that if you're describing the process of some research, it probably makes sense to start with the first the first hypothesis you had, present the results that came next, and then if anything followed from those, like maybe you got a new research question as a result, then you then say, so this raised another question and we did this other experiment. But that's not always how research goes. And so sometimes you have to change things, the order of things around, so that the person who's listening, who has no idea about any of this, understands, or let me rephrase that, they're never left confused about why they're now hearing about something, because you've always designed in an explanation to lead them to that stage, or to get them ready to hear about that first. And that's often what happens with PhD theses. you do 3 years of research, and then you write about it in actually a really what seems like a scrambled order, because you didn't do it in this order, but that's the way that the audience needs to hear about it in order for it to make sense to them.
Yep. I'd say as well for the 7 minutes, I don't know if you agree with this, Scott, but I tend to look at it as sort of slide a minute as well, for
sure.
timing. So that's something I'd say there, if it's 7 minutes, 7-ish slides thereabouts is average. So yeah, and that gives the audience time to look at the slide and time for you to discuss whatever it is that you're discussing as well. So yeah.
Yeah, and there's also another question which has come in direct to me, which says, how do we engage with our audience when the presentation has to be done online, like via Zoom? So a lot of the things you talked about from your TEDx training there were about eye contact, for example, and that can be quite difficult. So I'll put this question to you first, and then I'll think about my answer while you're talking.
Thanks for that, Scott. Do you know what? A lot of the things still stand. I think it's more so the tone of the voice when you're on Zoom. Making sure you don't have a distracting background is really important as well. So, ideally you don't want to have people moving back and forth behind you and so forth in a busy environment. Try and create that still space where you can speak and where the audience can focus on you and only on you. Obviously, they're still going to take around the environmental stimuli, but mostly they're going to be focused on yourself talking. And the body language, as I say, you still communicate mostly through your body language. So bear that in mind, don't use script, I'd say definitely, because there's nothing worse than, except for when you're actually watching somebody read script at an actual oral presentation, podium presentation. But I've seen many cases now on Zoom and online seminars where people's reading from something on their desk. So their head's completely down, and all you're seeing is the top of the head when they're actually giving the presentation, and it doesn't work, frankly. So bear that in mind, bear the context now that you're giving on the technological side by giving a presentation on Zoom. Bear in mind where you are within that scope, that visual scope, and how if you do things such as looking at notes, looking at this, looking at that, your head's going to turn from side to side, but they've only got a visual of this little area. Okay, so that's going to have a profound effect on what they think of your presentation, how you're communicating with your audience. It's very easy to disconnect when you're on a Zoom, because it is just this little window that you've got, and everything's magnified. Okay, so little things that you get away with, if you like, when you're on a stage, you're not going to get away with when you're on Zoom. So bear that in mind and just be aware of that. But otherwise, I think it's a case of just being relaxed and just talking and remembering that, yes, you're talking essentially to a screen, but you're actually talking to people. Okay, it's the same thing. You're still communicating, and try and forget that it's a screen that you're talking to. Like just now when I'm talking to Scott here, I'm talking to you guys. It's an audience as well. Okay, that's what's in my mind. I'm not talking to a screen. I don't even think about the screen at the moment. I'm talking to the audience. And that's what you have to get into, is that mindset of who you're presenting to, okay? And get yourself in that frame of mind, that mindset, because that's what presentation's about. It's about your mindset, okay? And having that perspective as well, so the nerves stay down too. Does that make sense?
It's also, yeah, it's also really easy to record yourself on Zoom and watch it back in a practice, for example, because then you can really tell the difference between how your voice sounds in your head in terms of, do you sound engaged? Do you sound like your voice tone is going, up and down like a normal human beings would if they were excited about a topic? Maybe excited is the wrong word. You don't need to be excited to do a good presentation, but you get what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And actually, what it sounds like on the outside can be very different from that. And it's not until you watch a recording that you can realize how different it sounds. With Zoom, it's super easy. So actually, a lot of the things about it are better. And I'm conscious of time, but we've got one last question that maybe we could take a quick pop at. Is it better to present the information as a picture and a figure than a text in a presentation? I'll take a first pass at that one. I think by and large, like on the whole, I'm trying to think of how to say this without an idiom. In the majority of cases, if you're talking about data or something that's like data, where you've got a question and then you've got an answer that can be measured in some fashion, then probably yes. Because the reason that we use data in science is to simplify things and give a visual picture. It's easy to spot patterns when you present a figure, and it stops people from having to read lots and lots of words to get to the same conclusion as they would with a graph. So for all of those reasons, I would say yes, and then maybe with some supporting text that explains it, because some of your audience will have stopped paying attention, right? And if they now see this new slide and they decide, okay, I want to start getting back into this story now, and all they see is the graph and they maybe missed half of your explanation of it, with no legend at the side or with no very brief description, it can be hard for them to comprehend it. So I'm not saying totally figures, I'm not saying totally text, but maybe a hybrid of the two that would help someone. Same principle as when we say put a figure into an essay or a paper. You've got to have that wee legend there so someone can understand why you were doing what you were doing, and maybe explain the key bits of symbols on it. What would you say, Michelle?
Yeah, I'd say, a picture says 1,000 words, essentially. So I think your figures and your visualizations are so important. Particularly, I think there's a shift now going towards that in human behaviour as a whole, actually, for how we digest information. So I'd say definitely visualizations are a major resource to utilise within your presentations. I think at times, just as Scott's saying there, you do need your text at certain points, but again, very sparse, very keyword text, because you're going to be verbalizing that, you're going to be discussing that, so it's just to keep yourself on point and to keep your audience on point to key factors that you're discussing through your presentation. But certainly, the visualizations of presentations, that's what a good presentation is all about. So stay away from large groupings of text. Absolutely, keep it sparse and to the point, keep it concise. That's really important.
And it's a really excellent question for us to finish with, because it gives me an opportunity to say that in 2 weeks' time, in 2 episodes' time, we'll have a conversation all about presenting data. So we'll go into this in much more detail. We'll talk about different types of presentation of data, some that are standard academic expectations and some that are maybe a bit more different, because again, we know that you're going on to careers when you finish your degree, and this is a chance for you to get some training before you reach that stage. So next week is academic posters. The week after that is presenting data. If you want to come to the class, it's on the Wednesday, the day before we record this, and the recording of the podcast will be at the same time as we had today. And if you're listening after the event, then thanks very much for tuning in. And if you have any questions, then you can find our contact details on the web pages where we advertise these series. But for now, thanks very much, Michelle, for joining me. It's been really fun.
No problem. Pleasure to be here. Yeah.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you. Bye.